Hello everybody! Welcome once again to another edition of Quick Trivia with Mike. It's the weekly quiz show right here on channel 955 where we test your knowledge of facts. Sometimes they're a little bit more historic in nature, sometimes they're very contemporary. Hopefully they're always a lot of fun. I am your host and the quizmaster, Mike Brever. You'll note the show seems a little bit rougher this week. That's because my producer and my editor, Scott McFerrin, is on vacation this week. I am flying solo. You'll note what we call bumpers, the lead-in music to the show and the music that exits the show. And of course the halftime intermission where typically there's some entertaining tidbits for you. None of that's on the show this week because Scott's not here to do it. We thought we'd give you a little bit of a sampling of just how much of an impact Scott really has on Quick Trivia with Mike. You know, we always begin the show with a brand new tradition here, and it is called Birthdays! Birthdays of the Week. Birthdays right here at East Castle Place. And this week we have two. In fact, I saw one of these women earlier this week, and I was able to wish her happy birthday. On June 21st, June Eastvolt celebrated a birthday. And on June 22nd, Joanne Kauth. Joanne Kauth celebrated her birthday as well. If you see any of these birthday kids in the hallways, I know by the time you see them, it'll be after the fact. But maybe you can wish them a belated birthday, and be sure to wish them one from all of us here at Quick Trivia. You know, this is the 116th show now that we've done at Quick Trivia. We hope you're having a good time with it. We know by now that you know how the game show is played. We give you 3 questions every week. We challenge you to find the answers to them. Then we give you 3 new questions for the coming week, and we hope you can do some research and find the answers to those as well. Once again, typically after the first 3 questions, we take a bit of an intermission. That's not going to happen this week because Scott McFerrin isn't here. Once again, you now have a bit of an idea of just how much of an impact he has on the show. We also are going without a guest host this week. Having to do the camera work and all the rest of that myself, just didn't have time to get a guest host in and educate them on the process of doing that. So you're stuck with me this week. Let's see how the show goes, shall we? You remember that last week we talked a little bit about amusement parks and roller coasters. A roller coaster, of course, is a type of ride that you see at an amusement park. It employs a form of an elevated railroad track, typically designed with tight turns, steep slopes, steep dives. Sometimes you even go upside down in them, inversions they call those. They've actually been around a long time. The first known patent for a roller coaster design was in 1885. 1885, 140 years ago. It was related to the Switchback Railway that opened a year earlier at Coney Island. Of course, roller coasters really came into their own in the 50s, 60s, 70s. A lot of it had to do with the Disney theme parks. You know, Disney really they've mastered the art of marketing, and roller coasters at their theme parks is really a big part of that. I asked you, again, the Switchback Railway at Coney Island, which was the very first known patent for a roller coaster, debuted in June 16th, 1884. They charged 5 cents a ride per passenger. It would go to the end of the line, it would switch back and come back, new passengers would get on. All that for 5 cents. They took in $600 a day doing that. So literally, $600 a day at 5 cents a passenger, that's an enormous amount of people that rode those elevators. Riders would climb a tower, typically, to board a large bench-like car. And they were pushed off and coasted 600 feet, the equivalent of 183 meters. And of course, in those days, roller coasters, and actually to this day too, basically work on gravity. You know, nowadays you have electricity and chains and pulleys that get them back up to the top of a hill. But in the beginning, they started at the top and they went down. But gravity still was a big part of it. I asked you, what was the speed of that initial roller coaster in 1884? How fast did that roller coaster ride? The answer, 6 miles per hour, 9.7 kilometers per hour. And that was going downhill on the track. And then, of course, it had to go back up till it got to the top, and it switched back down and back up again. 6 miles per hour. I know a lot of you in your younger days were runners or walkers. You probably did 6 miles per hour on a consistent basis. Not very fast by contemporary standards, and yet they had about 12,000 people riding the roller coaster every day, generating $600 in profit. Times have really changed since then. That, my friends, was the answer to question number 1. Question number 2. You know, my undergraduate degree, my bachelor's, I received it at UWM. Put in a little bit of time at Eau Claire, but ran out of money and had to come back home. Graduated from UWM. My bachelor's degree is in history. My master's is in management from Stritch, but history, it's been a lifelong love of mine. I find it fascinating. I try to learn as much as I can about it. We talked last week about one of my favorite topics, the Civil War. You know, the Civil War was the war that had the most United States casualties. Over 600,000 people died in the Civil War. Why so many? Because both sides were American. The Union and the Confederacy, before the war and after the war, were both recognized as Americans, and so all the casualties were American. We also talked about the fact that there were so many casualties because of the tactics of those days. The generals were still using Napoleonic tactics. Huge waves of people would charge at the opposing lines, but technology, the tools that they used for killing people had advanced to the point where death and destruction was wholesale. And medicine had not advanced to the stage where it is today. Back in those days, if you took a bullet and you broke a bone or something like that, gangrene was very likely to set in. If you didn't die from the initial wound, you would die from the attempt to recover much later in life. Well, at the end of the war at Appomattox Courthouse, General Grant, following with the lead that President Lincoln gave in the second inaugural address, with malice towards none, with charity for all, General Grant gave extremely lenient terms to Robert E. Lee. Officers were allowed to keep their sidearms. They were allowed to keep their horses and their baggage. They were allowed to return back to their homes. It was springtime and planting season. Grant knew that to get the South up and running again economically, getting people back home and working on their farms and homesteads, that was the key. And so the terms were extremely lenient. Immediately following the surrender at Appomattox, all the men did in fact go back to their homes, with the exception of Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, the general and the commanding general of the Army of Northern Virginia, never returned to his home again. And I asked you, why did Robert E. Lee not follow the pattern of all of his other men if he too was allowed to return home? The answer? His home was a plantation. It was across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. And the plantation was known as Arlington. Early in the war, the Union confiscated Arlington as a war reparation to chastise Robert E. Lee for choosing sides against the Union. You know, Robert E. Lee was actually offered the commanding position of the Army of the Potomac, and he turned it down, claimed he couldn't fight against his native Virginia. Well, to make sure that Lee could never return home, in 1863, the Union turned his plantation into a Union cemetery. It is now the most famous veteran cemetery, arguably, in the United States. It's Arlington National Cemetery. Some of our most famous American citizens are buried there, and some of our most famous war dead are buried there as well. As you know, John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, Abner Doubleday, the inventor of baseball. Not really. We'll talk about that at another time. Again, some of the most famous people in American history are buried at Arlington. Arlington was, in fact, the ancestral home of Robert E. Lee. The Union knew that once it became a cemetery, he could never go back. You cannot disinter the honored dead. And so he had to go off and do something else. He eventually became president of a university in Virginia, and that's where he spent the last 5 or 6 years of his life, never returning to live at Arlington. That was the answer to question number 2. Question number 3 from last week. We talked about the fact that Harry Houdini and Arthur Conan Doyle were actually very good friends. Harry Houdini, the master escape artist, the illusionist. Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, actually were very, very good friends. They were noted celebrities at that time, noted entertainers, and as a result of that, over time, they became very good friends. They learned that they had something in common, and they started to practice it together. They actually both believed in spiritualism. Arthur Conan Doyle, who later became Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, had a wife who was a noted spiritualist. She claimed that she could speak with the dead and convey messages to the living. Harry Houdini believed in it as well, but he was very skeptical because it was during the Victorian era, or just after the Victorian era. There were a lot of scam artists out there. In addition to looking for a legitimate spiritualist, Harry Houdini also took it upon himself to disprove frauds so that grieving people wouldn't be taken in by this. Arthur Conan Doyle's wife performed a seance for Harry Houdini, in which she claimed to have communicated with Harry Houdini's mother. The seance went bad. Houdini felt that it was a fraud, and he and Arthur Conan Doyle were never friends again for the rest of their lives. I asked you, what was it that famously took place in this seance that convinced Harry Houdini that Arthur Conan Doyle's wife was a fraud? The answer? Arthur Conan Doyle's wife claimed to be able to give a message to Harry Houdini, but she did so in English, a language that Harry Houdini's mother barely spoke and never used with her son. And because of that, Harry Houdini realized that Arthur Conan Doyle's wife maybe wasn't trying to commit a fraud. Maybe she had convinced herself that she could do these things. But Harry Houdini knew that there was nothing to this. It separated them as friends for the rest of their life. And that, my friends, was the answer to question number 3. Harry Houdini's mother spoke to him in English, a language that she never spoke. There you have it. Those were the 3 answers to our questions from last week. Normally at this time we take a brief intermission. Well, we're going to plug right along, and we're going to give you the 3 new questions for the coming week. Why? Because Scott's on vacation this week, and he's not here to do any of the editing. We're going to begin once again with a little bit of a look at history. We're going to look at Prohibition. Prohibition, which in the United States, of course, well known for the Roaring Twenties. It was the act or the practice of forbidding something by law. In this case, we were particularly talking about alcohol, the sale, the possession, or the consumption of alcoholic beverages. It lasted from 1920 to 1933 in the United States. There really was a religious movement that helped lead to this. And it actually was very much a worldwide phenomenon. Everybody thinks of Prohibition as a United States phenomenon, but many, many countries around the world did so as well. Specific cities, Detroit, Chicago, they became notorious as havens for Prohibition dodgers during the time known as the Roaring Twenties. 75% of all alcohol smuggled into the United States crossed from the Canadian-United States border in the vicinity of Detroit and Windsor. And from there, much of it made its way down to Chicago. A lot of the reason why Prohibition ended in the 1930s was, in fact, because of the Great Depression. In addition to that, it also was because of the fact that there was a great deal of crime that was brought about at the time of Prohibition during the Roaring Twenties. Gangsters took over whole cities, basically. There was, if you used 2020 dollars, billions of dollars was floating around in illegal alcohol at that time. Whole policing units, the Untouchables, came about because of America's fight to maintain Prohibition laws. So a lot of it just kind of outlived its usefulness, and people realized that maybe Prohibition wasn't such a good idea after all. And of course, making alcohol legal kind of brought some relief from the depression of the 30s. And you know what really brought us out of the Great Depression wasn't the fact that we made alcohol legal again. It's the fact that 25 million men went to work overnight as fighting men in World War II. We're going to check who's calling us right now. And you know what? You're much more important than that phone call. So we're going to keep on going. Whoever it is, I'll get to them a little bit later. There's an interesting anomaly, a quirk about Prohibition. You now know that Prohibition ended in 1933. But, you know, it really was a time of contentious politics between Democrats and Republicans. All kinds of things were coming up that people wanted to prohibit. One of which, on June 19th, 1939, became known as pinhibition. Pinhibition really became popular in large cities around the United States. Pinhibition. My question to you, now that we know a little bit about Prohibition, what was pinhibition? which was first passed on June 19th, 1939. That, my friends, is question number 1. Question number 2. We're going to take a look at a weather anomaly. Tornadoes, to be specific. Tornadoes, as you know, is a violent rotating column of air that is in contact with both the surfaces of the earth and a cumulonimbus cloud, or in rare cases, just a cumulus cloud. It is often referred to as a twister, a whirlwind, a cyclone, kind of the basis for the very, very famous Judy Garland movie, Wizard of Oz. It explains how she left Kansas and ended up in Oz. Various types of tornadoes include the multiple vortex tornado, land spout, the water spout. Other tornado-like phenomena that exist in nature include the gust-nado, the dust devil, the fire whirl, and the steam devil. You know, there is a tremendous amount of force in a tornado. It's an extremely, extremely dangerous weather phenomenon. And if you ever see a tornado, best thing to do is get down low in a residence, a basement or something like that. If you're not able to do that, stand in a doorway. The framing around a door is probably the strongest part inside a house. But again, if we're gonna get rid of that again, because we just don't have time for phone calls right now. We're in quick trivia. Tornadoes kill an average of 179 people per year in Bangladesh, a country noted for tornadoes. In the United States, there are about 1,200 tornadoes per year, followed by Canada, averaging 62 reported every year. The National Aeronautics Administration has a higher average of 100 per year in Canada. Tornadoes actually are most common during springtime, and again, it's an extremely, extremely dangerous phenomenon. I encourage you to avoid them if at all possible. My question to you: everybody talks about tornadoes, and as we all know, tornadoes have a home here in Wisconsin. A lot of it's because of the flat land, the farming. You know, you don't hear about too many tornadoes in mountains and things like that. They need flat land so that they can travel. There is a country that is known as the tornado capital of the world because they have more tornadoes per square mile than any other nation. What country is known as the tornado capital of the world? Not because they have more tornadoes than any other country, but they have more tornadoes per capital mile per square mile than any other nation in the world. What is that nation? That, my friends, is question number 2. Question number 3. We're going to take a little bit of a look at World War II. You know, World War II began in September of 1931, actually, when Japan invaded Manchuria. We recognize the start of World War II when Nazi Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, or maybe when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. But the beginning of hostilities was actually September of 1931. It's the most deadly military conflict in history. An estimated total of 70 to 85 million people perished, or approximately 3% of the 2.3 billion people alive on Earth in 1940. Deaths directly caused by military conflict, whether they were civilian or military, are estimated between 50 and 56 million, with an additional 19 to 28 million deaths from war-related disease and famine. Civilian deaths totaled 50 to 55 million. Military deaths were 21 to 25 million. The Soviet Union actually suffered the most casualties. Over 20 million people passed away in Russia. China was a very close second, also with more than 20 million people. We tend to focus on the Allies, but Germany itself suffered about 8 million deaths as a result of World War II. Just a devastating conflict. My question to you, you know, there was a period known as the Phony War. Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, and it captured the entire country in less than a month. Part of it was because they were allied with Russia at the time, who invaded from the east. Germany invaded from the west. Poland succumbed in, I believe it was 3 weeks, 21 days, Poland succumbed. From that point in time until Germany unleashed its war in the west, going through Belgium, the Netherlands, etc., ultimately surrounding the British Expeditionary Force in Dunkirk and then heading south towards Paris. The winter was a very calm period. It became known as a phony war. People wondered, well, are there going to be any more hostilities? Well, as we all know, 60 million people later, yes, there were tremendous additional hostilities. My question to you, during the phony war, when the British government advised the entire population to do something with their pets, specifically cats and dogs. My question to you, what was it that the British government advised the population to do with their pets as a result of the looming war? There you have it, folks. That's question number 3. Once again, I'd really like to thank Susan Comstock. I'd like to thank my wife, Mary Beth. Both got questions in this week that I ended up using. You want to get your name on Quick Trivia? Give me an idea of a question. If I use it, you'll be referenced. Or do some research and get some of those answers to me. If you get them right, I'll reference your name as well. There you have it. That's our show for this week. I'd really like to thank the president of ECTV, Tyler Gudex. I'd like to thank the executive producer of ECTV, Stacy Abbott. I'd like to thank my producer and editor, even though he's not here this week, Scott McFerrin. You can really tell the difference in quality when Scott's not here. And that's why I say his fingerprints are all over anything you like about Quick Trivia with Mike. I'd also like to thank each and every one of you. I know you have lots of opportunities to do wonderful things for a half hour's time. I'm very pleased you chose to spend it with me. I had a great time. I am your host and the Quizmaster, Mike Brever. Until next week, I ask you all to please remember those very famous words of the recently departed Betty White. As you know, she passed away 2 weeks short of her 100th birthday. In her later years, she became very famous for her sage advice to everybody. One of her most famous sayings is one of my favorite. I highly recommend you all get 8 hours of beauty sleep every night. Unless, of course, you're ugly, in which case I recommend you get 9. There you have it, everybody. I'll see you next week.